Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan and I are going to be out of the studio for a while, and so we wanted to keep the show going by bringing back some previously recorded episodes. This is a show that was originally recorded in 2017, and we hope that you enjoy it.
Mark was with us last week, and we talked about fescue, we talked about stockpiling, we talked about a little bit of frost seeding, and let's kind of recap a little bit on some of the things that we did discuss. We did talk about one way to extend that grazing season and to kind of have an insurance policy where you would have a nice field to graze for the wintertime is stockpiling. Mark, you want to tell us a little bit more about stockpiling?
Yeah, once again, kind of like we mentioned last week, it's just putting probably 50 to 70 units of nitrogen on some areas that you want to grow grass that you can keep the livestock off of after you've gone through either the last grazing about this time of year in that 1st of August time frame, or even up till middle of August, so forth. But go through, either run the livestock through and or clip it off with the brush hog or a mowing machine of some sort, and then putting some nitrogen on there to help get more grass growth, additional grass growth. Typically, we think about somewhere in the terms of an additional 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of forage growth for each 100 pounds or 50 pounds of nitrogen that we put on in those areas. So it's a way to, like say, probably grow a little less expensive forage that you don't have to use harvesting equipment to take it in, store it, and then take it back out to livestock. It can just grow there in the field, and it's generally real high quality when we take samples.
Right. And we were talking about how fescue was a good type of grass to stockpile with. We did talk about ways to reduce that alkaloid. When we talk about fescue, you can't not mention the fact that you can have fescue toxicosis.
Right.
Fescue toxicosis. Fescue toxicosis.
You'll get it.
Which is there's a fungal symbiont there. There's an endophyte that produces an alkaloid, which is toxic to animals, to mammals. And it can cause problems such as low weight gain, aborted calves.
Fetus, yeah. Not getting pregnant, you're not settling.
Blood flow to the peripheries being diminished and causing infections, and possibly you could lose that cow if the infection was bad enough. So we did mention that some of the tips that you can do to kind of reduce that alkaloid accumulation in the grasses is to remove the seed heads, because the seed heads are where a lot of the alkaloid does kind of accumulate. It does also accumulate more so in the summertime and hot drought times than it would in the wintertime. So using it as a stockpile feed after a hard frost is a good way to make sure that that alkaloid has been reduced. And also the alkaloid can accumulate closer to the crown, the growth point. It's typically in the sheaths where the grass blades are wrapped around the stem. Those are other areas that can contain a lot of alkaloids.
Dilution, I think, still is kind of our key, because even those hay bales that you made out of those areas had those seed heads and all that stuff. When it's wrapped up, it just doesn't go away. It's still there in that bale. So once again, if you know you have areas that's totally fescue and it's in that time frame when you got those seed heads, which would be the times of the year that would have the most that it's ever going to have, you need to think about that when you're feeding those bales out, so that the livestock, once again, don't have problems because of the fescue toxicosis there.
So let me ask a question, Mark. Does all fescue create that alkaloid?
No, there's some novel endophyte fescues out there. There's some
novel endophytes.
Novel endophyte.
What does that mean? Does that mean that the fungus isn't there?
Oh, no, it means that there's some fungus there, but it's a type that doesn't cause the problems in the livestock once they graze that.
You mean that alkaloid stuff? It doesn't produce the alkaloid?
What? You can explain that. It's all yours.
Right. Before we kind of get into that, there's also fescue that don't have the endophyte.
Lots of grasses may not have endophyte.
But we were saying one of the advantages for the grass is that the grass is more disease resistant, grows better. It typically outperforms the grasses that don't have the endophyte.
Right.
So let's say a fescue that does not have an endophyte will not make the livestock sick, but also won't be as hardy and as prevalent as one that does.
Probably not.
So what one of the I guess newer technologies, newer type grasses that are out there is a novel endophyte fescue, which has the fungus to help the plant, but it doesn't make that compound that creates all those problems that we mentioned before, such as low feed intake, low weight gain, and the rough hair on the livestock.
Right.
Which could also lead into low milk production and even major infections in the livestock.
Sure.
So this novel endophyte then it allows the plant to be competitive and also prevents the livestock from getting sick.
Right. And it's a good way to introduce some of those into some pastures. It's a little bit hard. What we found with some of the research plots that we've done, you can go in and burn off the old infected, mostly Kentucky 31 type fescue. Plant those newer varieties that's either the novel endophyte type. But what we found is, you have to stay with it because the old Kentucky 31 fescue, there's still a lot of seed in the soil. So sometimes it creeps back in, seeds will germinate, and over a period of time, it can get back to where you've actually got the old Kentucky 31 stand again. So management of those areas, trying to keep the proper height. Don't graze it down tight to allow those old seeds to germinate. Keep that ground covered a little bit once you get that new novel type endophyte growing there with your other grasses and stuff. And good pasture management is what you really need to do and want to do if you're going to spend the money to plant those newer varieties of fescue that's on the market.
Yeah, so when we talk about decreased weight gain, let's say in the endophyte infected plants, so how much of a decrease should you kind of keep an eye out for? Let's say you're used to seeing your livestock gain about 2 pounds in average daily gain a day on good pasture.
Yeah, and some of those feeder calves and stuff, you can pretty easily get a 2 to 3 pound gain, through the summer on good pasture. But when you start having pastures that may have quite a bit of
the infected
endophyte in them, then that rate gain might drop to a pound or below. So you might lose close to a pound a day on some of those, if they're using only or very high quantities of the infected type.
So if you're noticing that your livestock are really gaining half the weight that they normally would gain,
or what they should,
or what you expect, maybe you should, at least suspect some alkaloid problems.
Yeah. And you can kind of gauge that by the time that your calves are born versus, maybe the neighbors or somebody else at the sale barn. If you're seeing your calves are about the same age as theirs and you're 100, 200 pounds lighter, at the fall when you're weaning and selling, could be something in, that infected pasture that if you would go ahead and renovate some of those fields or dilute, once again, like we talked about last week, dilute those with some clovers or other type of legumes through frost seeding, some other methods that we can use, you might be able to bump that weight gain up and just make yourself more dollars without really a whole lot of effort or work.
Yeah, some of the tips that you also mentioned was making sure you're not overgrazing and clipping those seed heads again. Now,
one other thing about that too, several different studies have shown when you're increasing those legume contents, if you don't have much, especially if you're getting red clover and some of those other legumes frost seeded into those fields, conception rates typically go up. Growth weights typically go up. It's just a win-win situation if you have pastures or some of those hay fields that have, predominantly that old style Kentucky 31 fescue in it.
And what kind of clover do you prefer to dilute the fescue with?
Well, most of the time, most guys are using the red clovers, but red clover or white clover, either one. I believe there's some newer varieties that's on the market today that do produce, I think, a little more tonnage and a little higher quality feed. So, I would think about those if you're looking at putting some seed in the ground, like say as a frost seeding or whatever method you're going to use. I would look definitely at those newer varieties. May cost a little bit more, but I think in the long run they will yield a little bit better than some of those older varieties.
All right, and some other some other types of clovers here that would also benefit from that dilution of the alkaloid. Things like the white clover, meaning when we say white clover, right. What do you think about the small Dutch clover?
Well, most of the time when you end up with Dutch clover like that, it's because it's been overgrazed. And that's the only thing that can survive. That and the bluegrass is about the only thing that's left when people continuously graze and overgraze the livestock, especially if you got horses. They're kind of the worst at that. They want to go back to those same spots and eat, when a quarter of an inch grows, they go back and eat it again. So the old white Dutch clover, and we've all got it, but it's not going to be a real high producer for you tonnage-wise throughout the year. It's persistent, and you're not going to get rid of it, but it won't produce like the Ladinos, like the Alsike or Alice, some of the newer varieties out there in white clovers.
Right. Okay. So that's a good point. A lot of times we see a lot of those small Dutch clovers, and not to say that they're not doing things. They're still fixating nitrogen, and they're still high quality feed. But it's the bigger Ladino type white clovers. They'll give you more biomass, and typically will in terms of a forage biomass for the livestock to intake, it's much better.
Right. It's just a much larger plant, but you got to remember too, the size of the plant above ground has a relationship to the size of the root system below ground. So those little Dutch clover plants don't typically have as much root system underneath the ground as those bigger Ladina and other type white clovers too. So, it's just more of a win-win, I think, to introduce some of those newer, larger white clovers if you're talking white clover.
Right, and then when we are introducing these legumes to our pasture field, legumes do require an inoculum. So the plant doesn't magically do this by itself. Just like fescue isn't the hardiest by itself, it needs a mutual relationship. So legumes do have that kind of mutualism with a bacteria. It's a nitrogen-fixing bacteria that lives in the soil, and each type of legume uses a different type of bacteria for that process. And what happens is that legume will make these little things called nodules. If you ever pull up a legume, a nice red clover or something bigger, and you look at the root systems, you'll see these little balls there. Those little balls are called nodules that house the bacteria, and the plant will give the bacteria some sugars and stuff like that it can make out of sunlight. It's really no big cost for the plant, but those bacteria, what they'll do for the plant and the soil surrounding the plant is give it that nitrogen that's a little bit harder for the plant to obtain, a little bit less available, and you have that mutualism. So one of the tips that it's always good to remember when you are buying seed, when you want to introduce those legumes, let's say you want to dilute that fescue field a little bit, is to make sure you're buying fresh seed with good inoculum. And you want to make sure that you're storing that inoculum properly. The inoculum is basically bacterial spores that
it's alive.
Right, it's alive. So there's a way to handle it, and you want to make sure you're following those directions.
Yeah, you don't want those typically to get real hot. They should be kept cooler, darker areas. Some of the seed varieties today that we're getting are come coated with the inoculum on there. So if you're planting seeded varieties with inoculum on, typically you got to bump your rates up a little bit because the size of the coating does make the seed way different when you're putting that on. So a lot of times we'll say 3 to 5 pounds of clover seed per acre if you're going to do a frost seeding method. You might need to do a little more than that if you're going to use a seed that already has the inoculum on it, coated. But otherwise, if you mix that seed, put that powder type inoculum on yourself, you could get by with a little less seed as far as you're planting out there for the frost seeding.
Yeah, and let's kind of run through a couple examples on how to pick the legume that I want to for a particular area of my farm. So let's start with alfalfa. Alfalfa is a very high biomass producing legume. It really has good seedling vigor. However, it does not tolerate soil acidity very much. It does not tolerate poor drainage.
No, you gotta have good drainage if you're gonna have alfalfa.
So it does not tolerate poor drainage.
It does not tolerate poor drainage.
That's what I said.
You gotta have good drainage.
Right. So, yeah, absolutely. However, it makes sense. It has excellent drought tolerance.
Sure. It's got long, deep roots.
That's right. So in an area that's well drained and potentially in times of drought, maybe alfalfa would be a good thing to introduce.
But your soil nutrients must be pretty high level if you're going to continue growing alfalfa, or it just won't persist.
Which is a great point. Before you invest time and effort and money into seeds and just introducing something because the neighbor had good success with it, maybe the neighbor really fertilizes his or her field quite a bit, right, and you don't, so you wouldn't have the same type of success.
Once again, that soil test is just invaluable. Knowing the pH alone is well worth the price of the soil test, because if your pH levels start to drop, and typically we look at the scales and stuff, if it starts to get below that 6.2, even though some of the nutrients are there in the soil, they're not available to the plant for uptake. So if your soil pHs have dropped down into the 5s, or sometimes I see even lower,
right,
on some soil tests that come back sometimes from producer fields, ideally the first thing to do is, correct that soil pH, get it up to 6.5, hopefully 6.2, marginally. But then your plants have a much better chance of growing and producing the way they should.
Actually, out of the cool season perennial legumes, the one, according to this research, that does best in slightly acidic soils. Now we're saying slightly acidic because Mark's right. You start falling below 6 and the grass might be doing okay, but your legumes are probably going to be hurting because legumes like a little bit more neutral. Your bird's foot trefoil is probably one that tolerates acidity the best. However, it has really poor seedling vigor. So that means that you have to take extra good care of that bird's foot trefoil.
Yeah, more like 2 years or so to get it established well. And, bird's foot trefoil to me is one that this doesn't seem like it produces quite the tonnage that I would get out of some of the others. But, guys use it, and it does persist. Even on some of the strip mine ground around, I think we see some of that. But there's multiple ones. But, yeah, getting that pH up above 6, typically 6.2, 6.3 at least up in there. And like I say, if you're going to go for that alfalfa, then you need to be up closer to 7. Mm-hmm.
All right. Red clover is probably going to be your highest seedling vigor. Mm-hmm. However, it really does not fare well in acidic soils, and it, just like alfalfa, doesn't tolerate a lot of poorly drained soils. So it does need some well-drained soils, but in terms of that seedling vigor, your red clover is probably going to be the one that would at least take less, let's say, input early on, and maybe do a little bit better that first year.
Yeah, and just care over the lifetime of it. It's going to reseed itself generally in most of our situations where, like I said last week, start seeing some of those brown seed heads on top of those red clover plants. That's producing seed for the future. So those seeds are going to be there in the soil if they get a chance to germinate. So those clover plants will continue on, hopefully in the future.
Yeah, and if you're a little bit laxed on your management intensive grazing, the clover that typically does better in terms of close grazing would be your Ladino clover. Ladino is that white one that we talked about. Does a little bit better with that close grazing, but again, in terms of vigor, for Ladino clover, significantly less seedling vigor than the red clover, and also does not tolerate drought very well. But it does, because it has a shallower root system, it does tolerate close grazing a little bit more than the other ones that we mentioned.
Yeah.
And the whole idea here is to have your calves gain nice weight.
And your females you get more milk production, so that all helps with the weight gain on those calves. Good forage is a good thing to have, when you're trying to operate cow-calf operations or any livestock, that do foraging. And
in this area, Mark, do we have any programs that are kind of localized to really help out that cow-calf producer in terms of possibly maximizing the amount that feeder calf could get towards the end of the season, let's say before wintertime?
Well, we do kind of help work with the Feeder Calf Association, the Barnesville Feeder Calf Association. The last several years, they've gone to working with Daryl Watson at the Barnesville Livestock Auction to have 2 sales in the fall of the year where the calves are brought in the day before the sale. They're weighed. They're hand checked for castration. They're not allowed to have horns. If they've had no pink eye and those different kinds of things. So they have a grader grade the calves and put them in grades large, medium, and small frames, 1s and 2s, 3s. But those calves are all graded, sorted in pens of like size and kind, and then sold then on Saturday before the normal sale time there at Barnesville. So those 2 options, like I say, September and October, during the day, once again, the calves are sold on the in weight as they come in. So the calves are tagged with a tag that identifies you as the owner. And then shortly after that, those calves are run through the chute and weighed and then sold the following day as groups, once again, of like kind.
And that has an advantage. How so? Rather than just a typical feeder or a livestock sale.
Not typically. Most of the guys that's buying are trying to put together trailer loads, and they want to put calves together where they can put larger numbers in of the same size, same weight, so that they then come out also on the opposite end once they've grown. So putting together larger numbers of calves that's the same size and same weight, same configuration, conformation, typically grow about the same. That's what a lot of those buyers want to do. So most of the time we've seen over the past several years that the prices there at the graded feeder sale are as good or better than the average weekly sales that go on about those same times.
Right. So a lot of those buyers do have, like the stockers, the guys that buy stalker calves, they do have contracts that they have to fulfill, and typically truckloads, similar weight, and those contracts. And if there's a group of calves that will really do well in fulfilling that contract that they have to a stockyard somewhere, then they typically do. They'll bid a little bit higher. It'll be a little bit more competitive because they're getting a lot of the product that they actually desire to fulfill, to be able to fulfill those contracts. Some of the trends that we did see last year when we kind of looked at the prices in terms of the typical livestock sale and the graded feeder calf sale was not so much that people were getting a lot more on the high end, but it's that lower end. That right. Lower end was bumped up a little bit, which suggests a little bit more security in terms of, I'm not saying you couldn't lose money, but it's a little
right.
bit more secure of a sale.
Yeah, well, I think part of that becomes the fact that, a grader has actually looked at it, and if there is any defects in the calf, those calves then are rejected. They're not allowed to be sold through the graded feeder calf sale. So, once again, those who have pink eye and some of those, or maybe if, they're not castrated, calves going through the feeder calf sale have to be castrated and they're hand checked for that. So the buyer just has a little more I guess, thinking that he's getting a calf for sure. That there's not going to be
peace of mind,
problem.
security,
yeah,
right?
A little security that the calf's a good, healthy calf that probably is going to perform well for them once they hit the feedlot, or even if they're stocking them, on some grass yet for some more weight.
Yeah, so if somebody's hasn't really been part of the graded feeder calf sale and are interested, who do they contact, and how do they become a part of this program?
Well, we always want more buyers, so we'll start on the buyer side first. Come to the sale to buy calves to put back out on your farm. That's September and then October. So there's always
a Saturday, right?
That's a Saturday. Yep, and the sale starts at 10 on those both those days. So we're always looking for buyers to take those good calves back and then stock them or use them. And then if you want to consign calves to the sale, Betty Ward is the secretary, and she works with the Feeder Calf Association to do consignment forms. Betty Ward has been working with the Feeder Calf Association as long as I can remember, so she knows the consignments in and out. But you do need to consign the calves that you want to bring. So if you would call her at area code 740-926-1810, Betty could give you the consignment forms, the regulations and the things that you need to follow to make the calves eligible to be sold, on that day of the sale, each of those sales.
Yeah, and if you have a certain group of calves that you wouldn't mind trying this program with and seeing if you like it, if it goes well. There's a range of different numbers of head that people can bring into the sale. Some people just have maybe a handful or just two or just one possibly. And some people do bring in a lot more. But either way, the advantage there is that they are graded and grouped in a larger pen so that they have they're more desirable to the buyers.
Yeah, a lot of times on the Saturday sales or whenever the day sale is for the different auctions around in the area, you get a lot of pens that you just have one or two calves, maybe three, and not to say that we don't have a few of those in the graded feeder calf sale, but you'll have a lot more pens that's going to have in that 5 to 7 range, and then we'll have a few of those pens that'll have 20 and 30 calves, maybe 40 calves in a pen. They usually bring a gate cut of those into the arena so that the buyers can see them, but all good calves. So it does kind of group them together so they're of like kind.
All right. Hey, Mark, we're running out of time here. Right. And that's Mark Landefeld. And I am Dan Lima with OSU Extension in Belmont County. And you can reach me at 740-695-1455. And welcome to August, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.